Hello and welcome to Ask Lovecraft After Dark. I am your host, Lehman Kessler, and tonight I am incredibly excited to announce that we have on the author Craig Lawrence Gidney. Craig, welcome.
Hello. How are you
So
doing?
I'm doing fantastic. I am enjoying the nice warm, muggy weather we have here in Ohio. How about yourself?
Oh, we're just sort of melting in DC.
Oh no!
It's really a swamp.
Oh dear, oh dear. That's does sound like it. Uh, I had the absolute pleasure of getting to introduce to Greg when I had my friend Leah Bond run around Necronomicon 2 years ago with her phone, grabbing questions and brief interviews with various authors and artists who I would then answer on my Ask Lovecraft program. And Craig was one of those unfortunate victims who got snagged. Asked, I think, a delightful question about August Derleth, and
Yeah.
that was a ton of fun. That was a great introduction to Craig, and then I got to hear about his work and his writing. And then I was very, very lucky because Ross Lockhart at Word Horde sent me this very mysterious-looking advanced reader copy of A Spectral Hue, which just came out like less than a month ago at this point. It's
Yes,
very
the
recent.
19th. June.
And I reviewed it. PH reviewed it for Ask Lovecraft, and he was a big fan, as am I. And this was an absolute delight. I think Craig has a much nicer finished copy without the
Yes.
deepest black cover.
So it's the color of the spectral hue. So here we go.
There we go. Fantastic. Tell us about this book. This book was I didn't know what to expect. I sort of saw it, flipped it open. It was Word Horde, so I assumed there was going to be something strange and a little different about it, and that's accurate. But tell the good folks at home just what this book is about.
It's about a group of artists who are all sort of entranced by this muse. And this muse is probably a supernatural muse. It's set in modern times, and I suppose the modern characters are an art student who's interested in sort of these outsider artists that all come from this small town, Xavier Wentworth. And he comes to the town and he stays with Iris, who can, I guess you would call her a reluctant medium. And he stays in her Airbnb. And the third person is a itinerant sort of junkie that sort of is bouncing around the eastern shore from town to town, taking sort of like crap jobs as he sort of dries out.
Well, that was a fascinating. The first thing that sort of jumped out at me very quickly was seeing how this kind of theme of outsiders, the theme of folks sort of living on the margins, began to just jump to the foreground. I mean, every single character in this book, I guess you said, is either sort of a junkie, supernatural, a literal slave and or ghost. There is a lot of the overlooked, shall we say,
Yes.
that kind of come to the fore. Did that just sort of happen naturally, or were you really active about trying to sort of tell story, from these overlooked positions?
That's interesting. I think that when I went to get it, I actually workshopped the novel. And I think it was Sam Miller who sat up and said, who's a science fiction writer who has a new book out that's amazing. But he sat up and he said, you should just make it all black and all queer. You just go ahead and do it. Because I believe that at one point, Howard, who sort of runs the museum, was a main character. But
oh, interesting. Oh, okay.
He wasn't really coming through. And this was like, why don't you just push him to the background and bring these other characters together? And so it came very naturally that way. I didn't really think about the fact that they were all outsiders, to tell the truth. I just thought about their stories, and then it turned out that, yeah, they're all outsiders in some way or another. Yeah.
Well, and one thing I really liked, and we can consider it spoilers or not, but the supernatural elements of it aren't really, defined or set down. This could be a ghost story. This could be a fairy tale. This could all just, be sort of a lot of strange things happening inside people's heads. Although I think there's a certain proof that the supernatural is real within the pages, or at least arguably real. But it's genre wise, it's very fluid. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, absolutely. One of the things that I thought was interesting was when it was sort of published by Word Horde, and I guess people kind of have to pigeonhole things, and they're like, it's a horror novel. And it I don't really think it is a horror novel unless horror novels also include sort of just awe and joy and purity. I mean, there's definitely something eerie about it, and there are horrors in it, but it's not horror in the sense of just violence, mindless violence, or
No, I think that's absolutely
monstrous.
true. There's a creepiness again because and sort of the unknown aspect, right? People are sort
Right.
of everyone's kind of grasping at a piece of the puzzle, but never quite fully, putting everything together and being like, oh, like this is what happened. No one does the Lovecraft thing of finding a diary that like explains in 30 pages what went down.
Oh, yeah, the apocalyptic log trope.
Instead what they find is they find quilts, right, and an
Right,
impossible number of quilts, like it's things
right.
like that that's sort of uncanny, but really really beautiful, and the way that this you're talking about a visual medium, you're talking about art
Yeah,
in a literary one, and that can sometimes be very hard to translate because how do you get across this was a really nice painting? Okay, you've said it's really nice, but I have no context. I think you did a really fantastic job, not just of showing it, describing the art, but describing the reaction to the art, and the otherworldliness came out of people's sort of automatic, uncontrollable responses to what they were seeing, and that I think did a really good job of communicating it. What's your do you have a background in art history? Is this something that you've
no, this
studied?
is totally dilettantish. Um, I say
Excellent.
about 20 years ago, well, maybe longer than 20, I was in college, and this guy came to this class that was taught about surrealism. He was a specialist in talking about art brut, which is outsider artists, basically people who were mental patients who would create these complicated pieces of art that almost they were very supernatural to look at in many ways, because a lot of these artists didn't view what they were doing was as art. It was like a communication. Like it was just like, oh, this is the way I talk to God, and then there's a picture of art. There, and I was fascinated by that. Around the same time, after this surrealist class, I started working for my father for a summer vacation thing. He had a and he was a dentist, and his population that he helped was mostly sort of it was poor people, mostly poor, mostly black was his most of his dentistry patients. And there was this one woman that he told me about, and he said, there's this woman who, she loves writing stories, and you're a writer, blah, 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 blah. And he handed me a bunch of her work because she would just hand it out to anybody. And it was outsider artist. It was like, had this exact same thing as Henry Darger, who is like, I suppose, the most celebrated of outsider artists. And basically what she did in this book of poetry mixed slashed with drawings was that she just basically told the story of her life. And there was some story about how she was there was a figure she kept on talking about called the Chocolate Soldier. And it turns out that she was a widow of someone who went to Korea, and she sort of turned him into this mythic figure. And she kind of wrote this stuff just because she had to. She didn't have any desire to share it or anything, you know? And that's the thing that sort of sparked the idea behind A Spectral Hue.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, when one of your interviews that you gave, you had a really great line, which I found fascinating, where you talk about how you consider yourself more of a stylist than a straightforward storyteller. And when I heard that, that really struck me, because there is a story, like you're telling the story of these people, but it's very circular. Again, it's not just A happens, then B happens, then C happens. You sort of weave in through sort of time. You jump around through decades. And this idea of being more of a stylist, that struck something. But I'd like you to unpack that a little bit. What for you feels like the difference between being a stylist and being a storyteller?
Well, there are two things, I guess. When I was young, I discovered the work of like Tanith Lee and Patricia McKillop, and both of those people it's all style almost. And I just fell in love with that idea of the fact that language itself could be used to induce certain states and things like that. And there are other people who I am influenced by, like Octavia Butler, but she was very much of I'd say she was more of a storyteller. She pares it down. Her prose is very lean and it's just right there. And there are moments of lyricism, but she doesn't really go into that sort of weird opiate sense that I sort of love, that sort of Clark Ashton Smith sort of weirdness. And I like both of them, but I tend to go on the stylish thing.
And how did that work when you were writing Bereft, which was a previous work of yours, which was, from what I gather, more straightforward for a YA audience, kind of more in that sort of traditional genre niche? Were you still employing the same kind of ideal for stylism, or were you trying to kind of tell a more direct story there?
I was trying to tell a more direct story, but to tell the truth, with that particular novel, I kind of cheated and sort of had an organizing principle around masks. So there is a section where it sort of goes beyond where I get to go all crazy, and then it goes right into the story, because there's a mask motif that goes through the novel that I sort of like to push. And there were lots of dream sequences too. I love dream sequences. I know people don't like them because they think that it's cheating and all that, but I like that because you kind of get to flex the muscle and things like that. So Bereft is a realistic novel, but there are certain elements of it that I think that aren't, that sort of skirt around the issues of that.
And what led you to write Bereft, and why did you decide to sort of target it towards a YA audience?
I was actually commissioned to write it by the
Oh, well, there we go.
Yeah. I had written a short story, sent it in, and the publisher published the story, and she said, well, could you actually turn this into a novel? And I said, sure. And so that was my first stab at it. No, that's
Fantastic.
the only reason that I wrote that. Because I usually don't, I like to write uncensored in many ways. I don't really have an audience in mind. I don't want to, if there has to be PG-13 things in there, I want them to be in there, So it was interesting that I had to sort of play around with that.
Did you find that you having to sort of write to that YA audience, or did you sort of write, what you wanted to write and then just sort of cut out what wouldn't be appropriate or what might be a little shocking?
Yeah, but what I discovered was a lot of you can do a lot in YA that you couldn't do back in. Well, it's what I would like to call the Judy Blume kind of broke the barrier as to what you could talk about. And so, there is a masturbation scene in the book, and it was very important for me to have that in there, because if it's about sexuality, what do young boys do? And young adults do. So that was really important to me to put that in there. But it wasn't like, you don't turn it into chicka bow wow for kids. You have to elevate it and, write in their terms.
Well, and you said it started off as a short story. A lot of what you've written has been sort of these collections of short stories. Tell us a bit about the few that you've had published already. I think Sea Swallow Me and Skin Deep Magic are both collections. Is that correct?
Yes. So Sea Swallow Me was sort of, it was my first collection. And that one, as it turns out, most of the characters in that book are male in some way, or male. And then for some odd reason, when I got together with Skin Deep Magic, most of the characters were female. So it sort of was like an interesting mirror image of each other. And I didn't even plan to do that. It's just, I was writing stories about men all of a sudden. And then all of a sudden it switched over and I started writing stories about women. It's really odd how that came about.
Were these previously published stories that you then compiled, or did you write them sort of originally for this collection?
They were some of them were previously published, and then some of them, were written for the collection. And I sort of like, my publishing history is kind of spotty in some ways, in that, I had sort of had a collection before I had really established myself as a major short story writer. But, I still think that there's value in that.
And then I guess what brought you into the strange world of Lovecraftian fandom? You were at Necronomicon 2 years ago. I think you're going again this year. That is a very, as someone who is a relative newcomer myself to it, despite having done this Lovecraft show for about 7 years, it's been fascinating to see how that's a community that's really tried to define itself against horror and against sort of mainstream fandom. What drew you into that world, and how have you found it?
Well, moving back, I didn't really consider myself to be a horror writer. And what happened was, a couple of years ago, I guess the year before Necronomicon, I was invited down by Anya Martin, who I didn't know at all, to go to World Horror, because World Horror was, it was in Atlanta, and they were having I think it was like they were giving Tanith Lee a lifetime achievement award, and they didn't have anyone to sort of run the Tanith Lee panel. So she actually flew me down there to do that. And that's how I got involved in the horror world in general. And then because of that, I actually ended up getting in contact with, do you know Dim Shores?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yes.
Sam Cohen and his
Yes.
group. Because you had a collection through that recently as well, didn't you?
Yeah, I had a novelette called The Nectar of Nightmares. And that was, he contacted me because Scott Nicolay also had a piece with them too. And as did Anya too. And they're these beautiful limited edition illustrated little chat books.
Oh yeah, no, they're absolutely.
Absolutely
if you can find them, they are some of the most well produced works. And yeah, they tend to be short, but they're beautiful. And the writers that Sam brings together for these things really are top notch, and they're worth finding if you can.
Yeah, they're wonderful. And I ended up getting this artist to work with me, Orion Zangara, who I've actually never met, but he lives in the area. And he contacted me a year before saying, I really love Skin Deep Magic. And I was like, I would love to work with you, but I have nothing. And then all of a sudden, this just dropped in my lap and it became a perfect confluence. And then I published a story with Looming Low, which was from Dim Shores. And it was sort of like this compilation of new weird writers. And they sort of had their launch at the con. So, and I would say that my relationship with the con, with that entire fandom, is kind of touch and go. Because, to be honest, a lot of what Lovecraft did turned me off.
That is very fair.
And, I've written about this before, but I guess my younger brother was really into heavy metal. And lots of heavy metal people seem to borrow Lovecraftian themes. So he bought one of those Lovecraft compilations, anthologies. And it's one with really disgusting cover with dripping eyes and all that. Because it wasn't like the elevated Lovecraft. It was the really
no, it was like the great 70s. That's like really pulp. We're just going to lean into everything being moist and viscous.
And I remember I read this story called The Outsider. And I was like, this is absolutely gorgeous. And it is. It's almost like a prose poem. And then the story immediately after it was, I don't even know what it was called, but the first line was, I was talking about my cat, Inward Man.
Oh, that was probably The Rats in the Wall, which I'm intimately familiar with because I got commissioned to make an audio version of that. And it was the original version. There's certain editions of it where they changed the cat's name to Black Tom or something slightly more subtle. But I was commissioned to do it as written, and so I was like, well, okay, they can't say this name so many times. They say that damn cat's name like 50 times, like more than any other name, and I feel like any other one of his stories. I'm just like, Howard, come on, you are killing me. Yeah, it's awful. It's really gross.
And, as a result, I'm not as up on actual Lovecraft stuff. That being said, I put Lovecraft fans into two categories. The first category is the literature fans who are able to somewhat distance themselves and say, yeah, that was super problematic. There are no women, blah, blah, blah. And, I'm of the personal opinion, I can't prove it, but I'm of the personal opinion that Howard would be on some sexual spectrum. That's not,
Professor Kinsey would have an interesting interview with
right, exactly. I mean, he could be ace, he could be this, but there's definitely something going on there that isn't straight, and I also can understand that do you know who Chyna de Vil is?
Yes, very, very much so. And I've read some of Chyna de Vil's talking about Lovecraft, and he certainly has a lot to say.
Well, when I went to London and I saw him at EasterCon, he was talking about how if Lovecraft weren't such a racist, a lot of that sort of weird true believer fear just wouldn't come through. He was basically masking his racism and turned it into art. It's not pretty art, but it's art. And I find that part fascinating. So there's that side. Then there's the other side, which they seem to really like Lovecraft himself. And that's the part where I'm sort of like, okay. And the arguments and the things that they'll say, and I was a lonely kid and I can understand why he was a lonely kid. It's just like, yeah, but there's lonely.
A lot of us were lonely.
Yeah, I was a lonely kid too. I did not, write a poem about how much I hated a a minority.
Yeah.
I
No,
might have
it's
written
true.
right. And I think his obsession, particularly with the entire racial taxonomies and all that, I think it speaks to something deeper, that he was there was something really wrong with him.
Well, it's funny, right? I've been wearing Lovecraft's face for 7 years for this show, but he actually almost 10 years because I portrayed him on stage, and it's a weird headspace to get into, especially when you read his letters. Like, I mean, that's where I knew him from stories, but it wasn't until I really began to like look through his letters and see two things. One, man alive, was he even more racist when he's not writing fiction,
Right.
but also like how much of a real full human he was. I think we see, even in some ways, even especially from the defenders of Lovecraft and of his racism, he was the misanthrope, and he hated everyone, and he just he was this guy who lived in his attic and lived with his aunts, and just you can't blame him for that. But no, like if you read his letters, he is incredibly worldly, he is incredibly like catty and sassy and like engaging with people in a really deep way. Like he is obviously has real fond affections for people, and like he talks about his travel, and he talks about like just his aspiration. Like he's not just this shut-in who's kind of scowling and drawing monsters on his his school textbook. There's a real full-eyed human there, and that makes when he starts going into his rants about needing to fumigate the Indian subcontinent and stuff like that, even in some ways worse, because he's not this sort of broken hollow man who's filled with hate. He's a guy, and in some ways the kind of the humanity highlights that really just gut awful, just ignorance, but also willful desire to as you said, he was obsessed with holding on to these hatreds. SD Yoshi, who obviously is kind of, he's gone back and forth and talking about Lovecraft race and how we should view his race. But he had an amazing line in one of his books where he talked about, on every other scientific and social issue, when Lovecraft was presented with evidence, he changed his opinion. He changed his mind. He's like, okay, like I'm a hardcore, anti-socialist, but okay, I see how socialism actually has these benefits in these areas, and okay, I believe this about physics, but okay, this actually makes sense, and I can change that. But with even as the racial theory that he was holding on to was being debunked in his lifetime, that he wouldn't let go of. And I think, as you say, there's folks who try to hold the literature and folks who sort of cling to the man. And it's hard to separate. I don't think you can separate artist from art. I think especially with Lovecraft, where we are so obsessed with his story, we are obsessed with this idea of this weird old gentleman from Providence. People literally meet in Providence to celebrate art and celebrate fiction in his name. And that's complicated and weird.
It is weird. When I went to the con 2 years ago, the guest of honor was Nadia Corafor. And I just remember this very clearly. She had to go to all of the various things because she was a guest of honor. And there was this one thing where we went to this church where someone performed an opera piece based on one of Lovecraft. It might have even been the Eric Zan.
Oh, okay, sure, yeah.
Someone might have written an opera and they brought in an opera singer. And so she took a picture of herself on her Instagram going,
I think I saw that.
And I'm thinking, like, have you seen Midsommar?
No.
Do you know what it's about?
I've definitely been seeing everyone on my Facebook talking
Okay.
about it. Yeah.
So, I'm not spoiling it when I say it has to do with a Swedish cult.
Yes.
There is a thing when I watch that movie where, the guy from The Good Place, Chidi, is in it.
Oh, okay.
And
Oh,
I'm
right.
just
Yeah.
like,
William
and I'm just
Jackson
like,
Harper.
yes,
Harper
yes.
Jackson.
And he kind of plays a Chidi-esque character. And I'm just like, Chidi, that if you had got like any other person of color, it's just like a bunch of singing hippies in the thing. You're just like, I mean, I'm sorry. I would have
Whoopi Goldberg needs to drop in and say, "You in danger, girl."
right, exactly. And I'm just like, I would have my escape route ready even before I step foot in there. I'd be like, this is a lovely daytime trip. Bye. And that's kind of what I feel about some of them. Not all. Hashtag not all. There's plenty of people who understand that and get that. And they understand that some people who are the targets can't necessarily just say, oh, I just can ignore it.
Well, no, precisely. And I think, this issue with not talking about this ever, right? Because that's what shows up. Anytime someone points out, whoa, this cat's got a really weird name, they get dogpiled online by all these folks being like, oh, he was a man of his time. Oh, why do we have to bring this up over and over again? Like, forgetting that, like, as long as people keep discovering Lovecraft, they're going to keep discovering that
Right.
cat. And like that conversation is going to need to happen again and again and again, just like people, students are going to have to talk about the problems of Shylock again and again and again. And
Yeah.
like this idea that we've talked too much about it and there's no more conversation to be had, really, like, it's depressing when you think about it, because it suggests that no one else, certainly no one of color or no one who's, an outsider, is going to be interested in this work, has anything to say or anything to add. And it's a really depressing and limiting view, not only of just Lovecraft, but of art and about like how we communicate with each other. I don't know. I find that really problematic and depressing.
Well, it's what I like to call gaslighting racism, which is, I think that's probably the most popular thing I've written about in my blog. Like, it always seems to pop up all the time. And what I think gaslighting racism is basically a lot of white people will sit up and say things like, well, no, that couldn't necessarily. They could have been doing this, that, and the other. Like they make excuses. This recently happened.
Right. Is this part of the national conversation, Craig? Is that what you're telling me?
Exactly.
That maybe we have a hard time describing racist words and actions as racist when they are blatantly racist?
Right. I mean, you have someone saying, well, you should go back to Africa, which is crime-ridden and disease-ridden, as if the entire place is. And go back and well, that wasn't really racist. That was something else. It was bad, but it was something else. No, I got to tell you, no. That is, that's the you're not invited to party racism.
That's the sorry, Uncle Stan, you're cut off.
Right, exactly. And in this essay that I wrote about gaslighting racism, one of the things I talked about was the fact that at the college that I went to, which was in New England, I was somehow put on this racial equity task force, and I was like one of the student people. And I found out all these horrible things that had happened. And one of the horrible things that had happened was that there was actually a cross burning in front of an all-black house. So I go to lunch, and I tell people what I've discovered. There was this one girl who looked at me, sweet girl, lovely girl. She said, well, they could have been pagans. It's like, nobody burns a cross in front of black people because they're pagans.
Oofa-doo.
And that was my
Summer
first
child.
experience of just like complete denial. It's just like they came up with this alternate world. And it's
Hachi
like,
Machi Hoofa Do. Okay, yep. All right. Yep. Okay.
that being said, I think that that a lot of Lovecraftian fiction, especially stuff that's coming out now, actually is better than the Lovecraft himself and the ways in which it's worked. I'm thinking of, for instance, The Ballad of Black Tom by Lavelle, which actually, I believe Howard Lovecraft actually shows up in it at one point.
Well, I mean, that was brilliant because Lavelle had a wonderful line talking about it's the ultimate act of white privilege when when the most horrifying thing you can imagine is not being the most important thing in the universe.
Yes. Yeah. And it was a great story. I mean, the horror of Red Hook sort of reimagined. Then you have the work of Ruth Anna Emrys. And basically what she does is that she queers up all of the characters, and she wants people to, like, they're fish people who they want to be fish people. Fish rights. Yeah, matter.
No, she ties it to sort of like the internment camps and the sort of residential school system. No, that was such a brilliant kind of judo flipping of this again sort of horror story of, oh no, miscegenation.
Right, exactly. And so there's that, and then there's Kiernan, and the fact that her work is very trans oriented, very trans and lesbian oriented, and it's interesting that she sort of filters that through Lovecraftian tropes to talk about other things. It's fascinating.
Well, again, it's the weird way in which Lovecraft's stuff lends itself to being queered and to being about like others and folks who are sort of outside of the system, right? And even this idea of like a cosmic system that is malevolent but also somehow like not caring. I mean, completely doesn't even observe you, right? I mean, that does a really good job as a metaphor for so many of the systems we kind of struggle with. And so it's really amazing to see how either subconsciously or just through the the power of the author being dead, those themes are able to be brought to the forefront and allow allow a space where you can have a Ruth Anna Emrys or a Ballad of Black Tom or a Willem Pugmire. Like there's all of this room to play in. And again, largely because he had a kind of bizarre generosity of spirit as far as letting people take his themes and take his toys and monsters and do what they will with them. They have a sort of Shoggoth-like flexibility,
Right.
and it's very I don't know if it's ironic or strange or just that this incredibly bigoted man wrote stories that lend themselves to sort of undermine his bigotry. I don't know. It's
Right.
fun if nothing else.
It's fun, and that reminds me, there was this in the novel writing workshop that I did. There was this one guy who, I don't think he actually did anything with the novel, but it was fascinating. Is that he basically set a Lovecraftian story in sort of an urban setting, so that he called it his ghetto lit Lovecraft novel, and it worked perfectly. It worked really well. And you can tell that he was having fun, sort of taking the piss out of certain things. Basically, there's a weird black church that actually is a front for cultists. And it was just brilliant how he sort of mirrored sort of weird Christianity and gospel traditions with that. So
Fantastic.
I love that idea. So I actually, when I wrote Spectral Hue, the first thing that one of the critiques said, I think that the character of Howard is a stand-in for H.P. Lovecraft because he's kind of weird and awkward and all that. And I was like, I don't know. Quite.
Maybe if he talked about his ants a little bit more.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Well, that is absolutely fantastic. So we've got Spectral Q out now. Where can folks find it? Where's the best place for them to find out about you and your work online?
My website is craiglawrencegidney.com, and the Lawrence is spelled different than most people.
We have it in the show description, so
Yeah.
folks should be able to click on through.
Yeah, because you know, a lot of people misspell my name, but my mother was strange and she wanted that way. You can also find me, I guess the best place to order the book is directly through Word Horde, wordhorde.com, and then you'll get the beautiful image of this, which is actually what I love about this cover is that it actually changes in the light so that it goes between purple and pink.
Well, the problem is that whenever I see that color out in the world, I'm like, okay, what's going on? Am I being followed? What's happening here?
Right. Exactly. Exactly. So that's where you can find me. And
Fantastic.
then I'll be at Necroconomicon. So I can never say it.
You'll be in Rhode Island.
I'll be in Rhode Island, and I'll actually be on the Tanith Lee panel. They're doing a special Tanith Lee panel. She passed away in 2015, and she did weird fiction that was decidedly not Lovecraftian, but had its own weirdness to it.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you, everyone, for watching. This has been Ask Lovecraft After Dark. I'm Lehman Kessler. If you're interested in this program, we meet every other week. YouTube is, just a little warning, YouTube is changing up how they're doing these live shows. So we might have a little bit of program interruption as we figure out how to do the live shows in the format YouTube prefers. But in the meantime, you can still watch the main program, Ask Lovecraft, where I dress up as the old man of Providence 3 times a week and answer your questions. If you're going to be in Santa Fe or Albuquerque, New Mexico next Friday night, you can see me at the Jean Cocteau Cinema, where I shall be performing live as H.P. Lovecraft. If you're interested in those events or any of my other live events, you can go to lehmankessler.com. If you want to just see me screaming into the void, you can follow me on Twitter at Lehman Kessler. And if you love this show so much, you want to keep us on the air, you can support us at patreon.com/asklovecraft. Thank you all for watching. And Craig, thank you once again so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. Thanks.
All right. It's been an absolute delight. Bye, all.
Bye.